This is the world this weekend. Good evening, I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Tonight, as more unidentified objects are shot down over North America, suspicions are rife about who they belong to.
There's still much to know about it, but you can know that this is something that NORAD and Canada and the United States are taking extremely seriously.
Also tonight, Canadians answer pleas for help from earthquake-ravaged Syria.
No medical equipment, no food. 5 days after the earthquake, nothing.
And how one Canadian is making an already historic Super Bowl even more significant.
What a huge historic moment for a lot of our Indigenous peoples. A big organization like the Super Bowl are taking those necessary steps.
That's later, but first. Canada and the U.S. continue to investigate the origin of recent unknown objects shot down over North American airspace. The latest shot down by the Americans over Lake Huron last night. That follows one brought down yesterday over Canadian airspace near Dawson City, Yukon. Katie Simpson has more.
Good morning, everyone.
As he left Ottawa to board a plane for Whitehorse, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau stopped to give a rare Sunday morning public statement. His trip to the Yukon, a mere coincidence, planned well before the downing of an unidentified flying object over the territory.
The safety of Canadians is our number one priority, and that's why I made the decision to shoot down the object that was a threat to civil aviation and a potential threat to Canadians.
It would only be hours later before U.S. President Joe Biden would make that same decision yet again, ordering the downing of another flying object, this time over Lake Huron, in between Michigan and Ontario. According to a senior Canadian government source with direct knowledge of the situation, the object was first spotted in Montana on Saturday night and traveled east toward the Great Lake. Canadian and U.S. airspace was restricted for a brief time to allow an American fighter jet to shoot this object down in U.S. territory, the fourth object to be shot down in 8 days.
You can be sure that if any American interests or people are at risk, they'll take appropriate action.
Before the Lake Huron incident, Democrat and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said he was briefed by top national security officials about the object shot down over Alaska on Friday and the Yukon object shot down Saturday, which he spoke about during an interview airing on ABC News.
We have to look at each balloon individually
Were these
and see
balloons
what
Friday
this
and
does.
Saturday night?
They believe they were, yes, but much smaller than the first one.
Officials won't know exactly what they're dealing with until the objects are recovered. The Canadian government source says it could be days before teams reach the debris field in the Yukon. The cold, rugged terrain is making search conditions difficult, though the area has been narrowed down to a remote location near Dawson City.
There's still much to know about it. That's why the analysis of this object is going to be very important.
The big question is whether the last three objects are connected to the Chinese spy balloon shot down last weekend. U.S. security officials say that balloon was part of a larger fleet of surveillance devices. American lawmakers from both sides are demanding transparency as quickly as possible so that conspiracy theories don't fill the void. Katie Simpson, CBC News, Washington.
More than 33,000 people have died following Monday's earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. Now, almost a week later, the window for finding people alive is narrowing. A Canadian woman is among the missing. Two of her brothers have now traveled to southeast Turkey, desperate for answers and fearing the worst. Briar Stewart has the story.
So as you can see right now, we could only see 3 floors, so there's 2 floors missing.
Muthana Zora points underneath a partially destroyed apartment building that looks as if it could crumble any minute. He tried to pick his way through the mangled concrete and furniture yesterday after flagging down a crew with thermal imaging equipment.
He was able to detect in this very corner, right here, that there was a 10-degree body warmth. That's it. And he
thought it could be his sister Summer, who is staying on the first floor and has been missing since the earthquake. In a desperate act, Zora and 3 local Turkish men started removing debris until they had to stop.
We couldn't remove anymore because it could collapse on us or the whole.
Summer was in Antakya doing research for her PhD when the earthquake struck. Her brothers started making calls to the Canadian embassy but didn't get anywhere. Sumuthana got on a plane from Kuwait, and Samar's twin brother flew from Halifax to try and search for her.
It's a very grim situation. It looks like a war zone. And honestly, we're not going anywhere until we find our sister. We'll stay here for as long as it takes.
The brothers and one of Samar's friends have searched patient lists in hospitals. Today, they even went to a burial ground looking for answers. They've been told it could be weeks before heavy equipment excavates the site. But the brothers say they will stay put and keep sleeping in their car until they can bring their sister's body back to Canada. The number of dead across Turkey is now close to 30,000, while there still are a few miraculous rescues, including a father and daughter who were pulled from the rubble today. But most crews are working on recovering bodies. Officials say more than 24,000 buildings collapsed or were heavily damaged in the earthquake. Turkey has issued more than 130 arrest warrants for contractors and builders who they accuse of cutting corners and ignoring regulations, which may lead to buildings being more prone to collapsing. But the country's political opposition says the arrests are the government's attempt to deflect blame away from itself. In some of the hardest hit areas, the military are patrolling the streets. On Saturday, 2 international search and rescue crews stopped their work because of aggressive crowds, and there have been reports of looting. Briar Stewart, CBC News, Diyarbakir, Turkey.
Medical aid is flowing into Turkey from all over the world. But in Syria, closed and restricted borders and a heavy-handed regime have choked supply routes into hospitals. Syrian doctors and surgeons are pleading for help for the survivors they're treating. As Katie Nicholson tells us, medical aid from this country will soon be on its way.
From the comfort of an Ontario home office, a Skype call into the chaos of a Syrian hospital.
Dr. Samia, how are you doing today? He's doing 50 cases a day. It's overwhelming just to keep up with the crash injuries from the people coming.
Anas Al-Qassam speaks surgeon to Samia Kaddour, who has been operating around the clock since the earthquake struck. His Syrian hospital sustained damage, but there's nowhere else to go. And so many patients to treat, they've had to turn hundreds away because they just don't have the capacity.
They have significant lack of antibiotics and painkillers and anesthesia drugs.
Northern Syrian hospitals were already in hard shape before the earthquake, after years of civil war, closed and restricted borders, and a regime accused of diverting aid from the region. Videos shared by Syrian doctors with CBC News show makeshift hospital wards packed with survivors, a system on the brink of collapse, patients being treated with dwindling supplies like painkillers, while others lying outside suffer and wait. On Friday, another surgeon, Muhed Kaddour, recorded this desperate plea from a field hospital in Idlib.
No escape teams enter to the area. No medical equipment, no food. 5 days after the earthquake, nothing. When I see nothing at all, I mean nothing at all.
And as the supplies dwindle, the need for complex surgeries increases.
These are crash injuries. They need a complex health care. Hypothermia is a big deal. They need admission to the ICU. Many of them, they need intubation, right? Evacuation of subdural hematoma or abdominal bleeding.
The situation now is critical and will continue well into the future.
For the next phase, you're going to need to do more reconstructive surgery and more plastic surgery for the limbs injuries and so forth. But the concern after that is that these fragile communities will be exposed to infectious diseases such as cholera and so forth.
Now, Al-Qassam and a small team from Canada and the U.S. are heading in to help, something he's done many times before during the Syrian war.
One hospital received 500 cases a day the first day of the earthquake, and then hundreds of cases every day. You need to tell them, you can relax. I came from Canada to help you with a bunch of other physicians. Let's just take over, right?
And before he goes in, one more urgent appeal from the people he hopes to relieve.
He's asking the Canadian government, the Canadian people, to send supplies immediately as soon as possible. And he's counting on Canada as a good country of peace.
And counting on surgeons like Al-Qassam, even if just for a few days. Katie Nicholson, CBC News, Ancaster, Ontario.
Across Canada, people are pulling together to send donations to Syria and Turkey in the aftermath of the earthquakes. Efforts to gather medical aid, encourage financial donations, and arrange transport of supplies are happening in communities all over this country. Kwabena Oduro now with how Canadians are stepping up.
I miss my family. I miss normal life.
Syrian Quebecers are making their voices heard as they call for more humanitarian aid. Between the civil war and last week's devastating earthquake, Dalia Alashi says survivors are in desperate need.
We have been witnessing on TV the slow death of our fellow Syrians without any single help being reaching the most affected areas in northwestern Syria.
One of the messages from dozens gathered in downtown Montreal is to open the borders so aid can get to their families. Many fear for their loved ones' lives and for those still missing. Muzna Duraid moved to Canada from Syria in 2016. She wishes she can go back and help, but since it's not an option, she's doing what she can from here.
It's not fair to leave 4.7 million in northwest Syria without help. So we feel we are not fine, we are not good. We feel like civilians and our families are still there in the open air.
Ahim Abu Amar says he's losing hope about saving people who are beneath the rubble. But he remains positive that with the right amount of aid relief, they can save survivors, currently living without shelter, food, or medicine.
It's freaking cold, you know. There's babies, there's mothers, there's pregnant women, it's beyond speech. I feel like we literally feel troubled.
Turkish Quebecers are also working to get donations. The organization Turk Quebec is hoping to send 3 shipments a week to Istanbul and says it plans to collect from across the province. Similar efforts can be seen across Canada. Sim Sanol is with the Turkish Canadian Society based in Edmonton.
The information is the donations have been way more than what the Turkish Airlines can immediately take. But that is okay because earthquake recovery is very long term.
As the death toll continues to rise, organizers say they will adjust their calls for help and they will keep pleading for donations for as long as it takes. Kwabena Oduro, CBC News, Montreal.
Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets of Madrid today to protest the state of the city's public healthcare system. Demonstrators say the conservative-led regional government is favoring private healthcare providers, leading to a lack of funding in the public system. Many in the crowd are healthcare workers, saying they're overworked and underpaid. Madrid's regional chief, Isabel Diaz Ayuso, denies the accusation. She claims the protests are motivated by left-wing rivals ahead of elections in the spring. The Canadian national women's soccer team has called off its job action, but not because it reached an agreement with Canada Soccer. In a statement, the team says it is being forced back to work after Canada Soccer considered the job action an unlawful strike and threatened legal action. Members of the women's team want the same financial backing ahead of this summer's Women's World Cup as the men's team got before last year's tournament in Qatar. The women's team will play an upcoming game in the She Believes Cup this week, but in a tweet, Captain Christine Sinclair says the fight is not over and the team will, quote, continue to fight for everything we deserve and we will win. People in Yukon are marking a significant anniversary this week. Half a century ago, Yukon First Nations leaders traveled to Ottawa to deliver a document that became the blueprint for land claims negotiations in Yukon and opened the door to other modern land claims across the country. Juanita Taylor brings us this story from Whitehorse.
Hand games are a way of bringing First Nations people together. A team of players hide an object in one of their hands while the opposing team tries to guess which hand it is in. Here in Whitehorse, hand games kicked off a week of celebrations, commemorating the 50th anniversary of a victorious movement that paved the way for modern land claim negotiations in Canada.
We are not here looking for a handout.
That was Chief Elijah Smith of the Yukon Native Brotherhood on February 14, 1973.
We are here with a plan that will cost the Canadian taxpayer much less than if the present government policies and program continue.
The late Chief Smith, along with 12 Yukon First Nations leaders, traveled to Ottawa to present a bold document titled Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow to then Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
This approach which you have taken in here is one, therefore, which is very welcome to the government.
The document outlined how Yukon First Nations wanted to negotiate modern agreements with the Canadian government. No Yukon First Nation had ever signed a treaty with Ottawa. The document laid the groundwork for negotiations of something more than a treaty, land claim settlements that included self-government and compensation. Sam Johnston, then chief of the Teslin Tlingit Council, was part of the delegation that went to Ottawa.
The message was that we wanted to rule our own lives. Trudeau and his bunch were very impressed with the Yukon document.
The document described the struggles First Nations faced throughout the 19th and 20th centuries.
Dawson was an American town on Canadian soil,
when waves of fur traders and gold seekers descended on the region, and the impact of residential schools and government control over First Nations lives. Historian Ken Coates describes the document as a turning point in Canadian history.
It actually changed the trajectory of Indigenous rights across the country as a whole, that you could actually rewrite the rules of Canadian law, rewrite the standard approach to Indigenous affairs in this country.
The Prime Minister accepted the document, but it still took more than 20 years for the first settlement in Yukon to be signed, and 3 of Yukon's 14 First Nations are still negotiating. Still, the agreements that flowed out of the document guide much of the territory today, with First Nations at the table in all facets of life, including government, land management, business to education. Kwanlin Dun First Nation Chief Doris Bill.
You know, our people are able to get mortgages now. They can buy their own house. We're able to lease land to, generate wealth for the future.
Celebrations will continue throughout the week, recognizing the profound effect that historic trip and document had on Yukon life and on land claim negotiations across Canada. Juanita Taylor, CBC News, Whitehorse.
Most classical music fans will have heard of the Lincoln Center in New York, the home of the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. But who knew it was also cursed? Well, now the curse has been lifted, and Canadian architects were some of the wizards involved. Chris Reyes now on the Lincoln Center's sonic rebirth.
Colin Williams is a longtime trombone player for the New York Philharmonic. For years, there was always something missing whenever he played on his home turf.
A lot of these sounds would kind of blend together. There wasn't very much clarity. It was kind of a tinny kind of sound.
He's describing the sound of the orchestra at the Lincoln Center. Despite being one of the most prestigious concert halls in the world, it had the kind of reputation no place of music would ever want to have.
The problem was you couldn't hear.
A problem that New York Phil's CEO, Deborah Borda, has been determined to fix almost her entire 30-year career.
Everybody knew right away the sound was no good from the orchestra, and the orchestra couldn't hear each other on the stage.
In 1992, she oversaw one of 2 very expensive renovations, the other in 1976. Neither worked, cementing that very undesirable reputation.
So take me back now and talk to me about this so-called curse that this curse had and that could not be lifted for decades.
The hall was revamped and it sounded better, but it didn't look great. And then it didn't sound that much better. And then for years it deteriorated. The orchestra still couldn't really hear each other.
With every renovation, Williams and his fellow musicians would have one wish.
Oh my God, please let them lift the curse this time.
This time came in 2015, powered by a $500 million budget. $100 million coming from media mogul David Geffen, earning him naming rights. And that's when Canadian architect Gary McCluskey and his Toronto-based team at Diamond Schmidt got a call he'll never forget.
Now it's come down to you to really help us make this great new space. It's an icon of 20th century architecture in North America and the world. So it was the project of a lifetime.
Through the pandemic, McCluskey worked with a team of architects, designers, and more importantly, acousticians. essentially sound magicians.
This was one of the high wire acts and acoustics for sure.
Paul Scarborough led the project for Connecticut-based company Acoustics.
We pulled the stage 25 feet out into the room to bring everybody closer to what was happening on stage. The next major move was to completely reconfigure the ceiling over the stage. We redid the walls. It was tremendously rewarding to get to work on it.
McCluskey's team served up that sound in their design. A room now full of curves, golden color of beechwood everywhere, accents of walnut on the seats.
It feels like we're in an instrument because we are in a musical instrument.
The question now, what does it sound like? Last October, ahead of schedule and under budget, David Geffen Hall reopened. During a top-secret rehearsal last summer, everyone held their breath for those very first notes. Trombone player Williams knew right away.
And I just remember those first tremolos, I was like, it was like a different orchestra in a sense.
The curse had been lifted. Borda felt it.
We were all in tears. We were all in tears.
So incredible, McCluskey couldn't help but put a Canadian signature high up in the ceiling.
And so there's 4 of these steel beams. One of them has a big maple leaf drawn on it.
A lifted curse, a happy ending.
You know, I rarely say this. I've been in this business a long time. This turned out beyond my expectations. Beyond my expectations.
A grand finale fit for a symphony. Chris Reyes, CBC News, New York.
You're listening to The World This Weekend on CBC Radio. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. You can listen to this program anytime on the CBC Listen app or on the CBC News YouTube channel. Starting Mondays, you can download a special curated edition of the program featuring our favorite stories from the weekend. For the first time in Super Bowl history, 2 black starting quarterbacks will face off in the most watched annual sporting event worldwide. To add to this historic moment, a Cree dancer from Saskatchewan will be showcasing his Indigenous culture for what may be his largest crowd yet, as the Kansas City Chiefs take on the Philadelphia Eagles in Glendale, Arizona. Philip Lee Shannock reports.
In full regalia, Patrick Mitsouing dances before a crowd of 70,000 at State Farm Stadium and an estimated 100 million viewers in the U.S. alone before Super Bowl 57 in Glendale, Arizona.
Means a lot. It's just you have an organization that, is taking on that path of truth and reconciliation, long overdue, but so excited that they're doing it,
He's Cree from the Makwasugagan First Nation and says being asked to dance here at such a major event is a hopeful sign that the U.S. mainstream is moving past hurtful stereotypes.
Like back home in Canada, when truth and reconciliation, all that comes out, people start hearing the stories and they start to sympathize and empathize with, our story. And I'm seeing that here.
And for the first time ever in Super Bowl history, a land acknowledgement, something that in Canada is commonly heard before meetings ranging from school boards to Parliament. But at this major American sporting event, reconciliation is not an easy sell. Rhonda Lavaldo is a Acoma Pueblo and founder of Not in Our Honor, a coalition lobbying major sports teams to drop offensive mascots, names, and logos. She came from New Mexico to protest outside the stadium, pushing the Kansas City Chiefs to change the team's name and fan behavior like the tomahawk chop.
We're just trying to educate people about the historical perspective of why we're doing this. I think that's kind of hard with fans just walking in. You get a lot of them just come at us and they do the chop in our face.
A University of Michigan study published in 2020 found Native team mascots hurt the self-esteem of Native youth and is tied to depression and self-harm. Lavaldo agrees.
I just want to be seen as a human being and not as this thing you're mocking. It really messes with our identity
Mitsui is hopeful.
I think it's going to change. You know, like this is the beginning of it. When you do land acknowledgements and you get inclusion and you start working with Indigenous people, you start realizing we're not mascots.
Campaigns like this have had results. Edmonton's CFL team changed its name to the Elks in 2021. Last year, Washington's NFL team was rebranded the Commanders. Philip Shannock, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, the Super Bowl is kicking off very soon with the Philadelphia Eagles playing Kansas City in Arizona. And to bring us all the buzz, we reached Steve Futterman at the State Farm Stadium in Glendale. Steve, what's the atmosphere like?
Well, you know, they've had 2 weeks to build up this game, and the Eagle fans are here, the Kansas City fans are here. There are lots of just football fans inside the stadium. It's quite a remarkable scene, typical of a Super Bowl, but it's still remarkable when you see finally the game take place after the interviews, after the predictions, after the parties, everything. It's now finally time for the football game. Now, people got here, not surprisingly, very early, and every year I cover a Super Bowl, you talk to the fans from the two participating teams. They are not only confident, they are 100% confident. Listen to this Eagles fan I spoke to.
Eagles by 7.
Any doubts at all? Any?
Not at all.
0.
0 doubts.
100%.
100%. No doubts.
I always love, they're always 100% sure. By the way, one of these fans is going to be wrong by the end of the night. This is the Kansas City fan I spoke to. He is one of their, I guess, mascots. He dresses up in the Kansas City regalia. He even has a nickname.
Yeah, I'm Weird Wolf, keeper of the Wolf Pack. Today it's 100%, baby. We're taking them Eagles down 30-24. Eagles going to have a last-minute drive, but they're going to fail because the Chiefs' defense is going to come through.
So he even is telling you the final score and how the game will end. The fans are remarkable.
Steve, I love the confidence here.
Yes.
But this game is significant for another reason, right? Can you tell us about the history being made on the field?
Oh, yeah, and this is very significant. You know, we talk about the fun in games, who throws the farthest passes, who runs the most yards, but this is quite important. For the first time, this game signifies the first time 2 black quarterbacks have started a Super Bowl. You've had African-American quarterbacks in the past. Doug Williams won the first one way back when for the Washington Redskins many years ago when they were still called that name. But today, both quarterbacks are African-Americans. And the reason this is so significant is because for so many years, African-American quarterbacks who did well in college would come into the pros, and the NFL would say, well, you're a good player, but you're not going to play quarterback. They moved them to other positions. Some players went to play in the CFL, players like Warren Moon. So this is significant. It shows the progress that has been made. Obviously, a great deal of progress needs to be made in other areas like coaching and general managers. Not as many blacks in those areas as probably there should be, but this is a significant step forward, and I think it's going to be very important when you look back upon this game. In addition to whoever wins, this will be the game where the 2 starting quarterbacks for the first time were African Americans.
Steve Futterman at the Super Bowl in Arizona. Thank you so much, Steve.
Great to be with you.
As you've heard, this Super Bowl is historic. It's the first time the 2 starting quarterbacks are black. But that's nothing new on this side of the border. Let us take you back to November 22nd, 1981. John and Vangelis' song The Friends of Mr. Cairo was #1 on the charts, Trudeau was Prime Minister, and at Olympic Stadium in Montreal, one of the greatest Grey Cup games ever was about to be played.
It's the 81 opener of football, Canadian style, as Grey Cup champion Edmonton travels to Ottawa for live professional football from Canada.
Underdog Ottawa was taking on powerhouse Edmonton, and the 2 quarterbacks were both black.
Warren Moon. Will the Ottawa Rough Riders be able to contain him? J.C. Watt. We'll see if he can't be the star of the 1981 Grey Cup game.
Both Watts and Moon are examples of American players who came to the CFL because they were passed over as NFL quarterbacks at a time when most NFL quarterbacks were white. Chuck Ely did the same. He was the first black quarterback to win a Grey Cup in 1972.
Fortunately for me, the Canadian Football League came down, which I knew very little about, and it gave me the opportunity to come to Canada, which was a great opportunity for me.
Well, that Ottawa football team deserves so much credit. What a gallant bunch of football players they were this afternoon.
Ottawa almost pulled off a massive upset in that 1981 game, but Edmonton prevailed. a bit of our history as Philadelphia and Kansas City make their own. You've been listening to The World This Weekend. I'm Stephanie Skandaris. Good night.